Sometimes life has a way of giving us exactly what we need when we least expect it. For 61-year-old Ray Dobbs, that unexpected gift came in the form of a crumbling old saloon and a half-blind dog he never wanted. When Ray inherits his estranged uncle's abandoned property in a forgotten ghost town, he plans to sell it quick and move on with his life. The place is falling apart, choked with dust and bad memories. But Duke, the old German shepherd left behind, keeps scratching persistently at something behind the old bar. One rainy night, the dog uncovers a hidden compartment filled with old ledgers and maps pointing to something called the McAllister Lode, a lost gold vein worth millions today. As shady developers circle like vultures and family secrets emerge. From the shadows, Ray realizes this inheritance might be more than just luck. But what if the real treasure isn't the gold at all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ray Dobbs had always believed that a man's luck ran out about the same time his knees did. At 61, both had seen better days. He sat in his rusted pickup truck outside the offices of Henderson and Associates, staring at the legal documents that had just turned his world sideways. The inheritance letter felt heavier than it should have, considering it was just a piece of paper. The Lucky Strike Saloon and all associated property in Cedar Flats, Montana, he read aloud, his voice rough from years of dust and disappointment, along with all furnishings, livestock, and personal effects. The lawyer had explained it twice, but Ray still couldn't wrap his head around it. Uncle Jeremiah, dead these 33 years, had left him something. The drive to Cedar Flats took him through country he'd never seen before, despite living in Montana his whole life. The highway gave way to gravel roads, then to dirt tracks. That seemed to lead nowhere. His truck bounced over ruts deep enough to lose a tire in, and with each mile, Ray wondered what kind of fool leaves a saloon to a nephew he hadn't spoken to since the Carter administration. The hills rolled away, on either side, covered in sage and sparse grass that had already given up on summer. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, probably wondering the same thing Ray was. What was he doing out here in the middle of nowhere? The radio had given up trying to find a signal 20 miles back, leaving only the rumble of his engine and the whistle of wind through the half-open windows. When Cedar Flats finally appeared, it wasn't so much a town as a collection of buildings that had surrendered to time. Main Street stretched maybe 3 blocks, lined with structures that looked like they were holding each other up out of pure stubbornness. A few showed signs of life. A general store with a faded Coca-Cola sign, a post office that probably saw more tumbleweeds than mail, and at the far end, the Lucky Strike Saloon. Ray parked in front of the saloon and sat for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The building was exactly what he'd expected, and somehow worse. 2 stories of weathered wood and broken dreams, with a covered porch that sagged like an old man's shoulders. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips, and ivy had claimed most of the east wall. A sign hung crooked above the batwing doors. Lucky Strike Saloon, Esther, 1881, with the L in Lucky hanging by a single nail. The first thing that greeted him when he climbed out of the truck was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of open country, but the kind of silence that came from a place that had forgotten how to make noise. Even his footsteps on the wooden porch seemed too loud, like he was disturbing something that preferred to be left alone. The front doors weren't locked. Hell, one of them wasn't even properly hinged anymore. Inside, dust motes danced in columns of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the boarded windows. The air tasted old, thick with decades of cigarette smoke, spilled whiskey, and stories that would never be told again. The main room held the skeleton of what had once been a proper saloon. A long bar dominated one wall, its mahogany surface dulled by years of neglect, but still solid underneath the grime. Behind it, a mirror ran the length of the wall, cracked in several places, but still reflecting Ray's weathered face back at him. Bottles lined the shelves, most empty, some still holding an inch or two of liquid that had probably turned to something resembling paint thinner. Tables and chairs were scattered around the room like dice thrown by a careless gambler. Some were overturned, others stacked in corners where someone had made a half-hearted attempt at cleaning up. A piano sat in the far corner, its keys yellow with age and several missing entirely. Sheet music was scattered across the floor around it, the notes faded but still readable. "Oh, Susanna," and "Sweet Betsy" from Pike. It was while Ray was examining the piano that he heard the first sound that wasn't his own footsteps, a low whine, followed by the scratch of claws on wood. He turned to find a German shepherd watching him from the bottom of the stairs that led to the second floor. The dog was old. That much was clear from the grey around his muzzle and the slight clouding in his brown eyes, but he was alert, head tilted, as if he was trying to decide whether Ray was friend or foe. "Well, hello there," Ray said softly, crouching down and extending his hand. "You must be the other part of my inheritance." The dog approached cautiously, sniffing Ray's outstretched fingers before allowing a tentative pat on the head. A collar hung loose around his thick neck, and Ray could just make out the name Duke engraved on a tarnished tag. "Duke, is it?" Ray scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling some of the tension in the animal's muscles ease. "I guess we're both wondering what the hell we're supposed to do now." The stairs creaked under their combined weight as Ray explored the second floor. 3 rooms opened off a narrow hallway, 2 small bedrooms, and what might have been an office. All were thick with dust and shadow, furnished with the kind of heavy wooden furniture that was built to last and had. In the largest bedroom, Ray found a wardrobe filled with clothes that had gone out of style before he was born, and on the nightstand, a photograph in a tarnished silver frame. Ray picked up the photograph carefully, wiping dust from the glass with his sleeve. The image was faded but clear enough. 3 men standing in front of the saloon, probably taken sometime in the 1980s, based on the clothing. He recognized Uncle Jeremiah immediately, even though the man in the photo was younger than Ray remembered. Him. Jeremiah stood in the middle, one hand on the shoulder of a man Ray didn't recognize, the other reaching down to pat a German shepherd that could have been Duke's father or grandfather. The sight of his uncle's face brought back a flood of memories Ray had spent years trying to forget. Family gatherings that ended in shouting matches. His father and Jeremiah locked in arguments about money, land, and old grievances that Ray had never fully understood. The last time he'd seen his uncle, Ray had been 19 and full of anger at the world in general and his family in particular. Jeremiah had tried to talk to him at their father's funeral, but Ray had been too proud and too hurt to listen. Now, staring at the photograph, Ray felt the weight of all those lost years. His uncle looked happy in the picture, surrounded by friends, and probably the ancestor of the dog, who now leaned against Ray's leg. What had happened to change that? What had driven Jeremiah away from family, and finally to wherever he'd gone to die? Duke whined softly and pawed at Ray's boot, bringing him back to the present. The light outside was already starting to fade, and Ray realized he needed to make some practical decisions. The nearest motel was probably 50 miles away, and his truck wasn't in the mood for another long drive today. The saloon had electricity. The lawyer had mentioned that the utilities were still connected, and there was bound to be somewhere upstairs he could spread out his sleeping bag. Before settling in for the night, Ray walked around the buildings. Exterior, Duke trailing behind him like they'd been partners for years. The property was larger than it had appeared from the front, extending back to include what had once been a stable and a small house that might have served as living quarters. For the saloon's owner, both buildings were in even worse shape than the main structure, but the land itself was solid, with good bones underneath the neglect. As he completed his circuit, Ray noticed a woman working in a garden plot about a quarter-mile away. She was maybe his age, with grey hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat, and she was watching him with the frank curiosity of someone who didn't see strangers often. When their eyes met, she raised a hand in greeting, and Ray found himself walking in her direction. "You must be Jeremiah's nephew," she called out when he was close enough to hear her without shouting. "I'm Martha Henley. Live just over that." "Arise!" She gestured toward a small ranch house, barely visible through the cottonwoods. "Heard you might be coming to settle things." "Ray Dobbs," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Not sure about settling anything just yet. Mostly trying to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do with a falling-down saloon and a dog." Martha smiled, wiping her hands on a towel tucked into her belt. "Duke's a good dog. He's been living off scraps I've been bringing by and whatever he can catch on his own. Smart as they come, that one. Jeremiah always said Duke was worth his weight in gold." The phrase made Ray glance back at the saloon, already looking different in the gathering dusk. "How well did you know my uncle?" "Well enough," Martha said carefully. "He was a good neighbor, mostly kept to himself, but always ready to lend a hand when needed. We all wondered what happened to him when he just up and disappeared. One day he was here, next day he wasn't. Sheriff looked into it some, but Jeremiah was a grown man with no family close by. If he wanted to leave, that was his business." Ray nodded, but something in Martha's tone suggested there was more to the story. "Any idea why he'd leave this place to me? I mean, we weren't close. Hadn't spoken in decades." Martha studied his face in the fading light. "Maybe he figured family was family, no matter how much time had passed. Or maybe he knew you'd need it someday." She paused, glancing at Duke, who had settled himself at Ray's feet like he belonged there. "Sometimes the best gifts are the ones we don't think we want." As Ray and Duke made their way back to the saloon, Martha's words echoed in his mind. The building looked even more forlorn in the evening shadows, but there was something about it that felt familiar, like coming home to a place he'd never been. Maybe it was the photograph upstairs, or the way Duke seemed to know every creaking, board and loose step. Or maybe it was just the exhaustion of a man who'd been running from his past so long, he'd forgotten there might be something worth running toward. He settled into the least dusty of the upstairs bedrooms, rolling out his sleeping bag on a mattress that had probably seen better decades. Duke curled up on the floor beside the bed, apparently satisfied that Ray was going to stick around at least until morning. Through the broken window, Ray could hear the wind picking up, rattling the loose boards and setting the old building to creaking like a ship at sea. Tomorrow he'd start making phone calls, finding out what the property was worth and how quickly he could sell it. Tonight, though, he was content to lie in the darkness and listen to the sounds of a building that had sheltered 3 generations of stories. Somewhere in the walls around him were the echoes of laughter, arguments, deals made and broken, lives lived and mourned, and somewhere in all of that history was the answer to why Uncle Jeremiah had thought Ray Dobbs, of all people, deserved a second chance. Ray woke to the sound of scratching. In the grey light of dawn, he could see Duke at the foot of the bed, paws working methodically at something on the floor. The dog had been restless all night, pacing between the bedroom and the stairs, whining softly as if he was trying to tell Ray something important. "What's got into you, boy?" Ray sat up, his back protesting the night spent on a mattress that had given up being comfortable sometime during the Reagan years. Duke looked at him with those cloudy brown eyes, then trotted purposefully toward the stairs. When Ray didn't immediately follow, the dog returned, grabbed Ray's boot in his teeth and tugged. All right," Ray grumbled, pulling on his clothes. "Lead the way." Downstairs, Duke went straight to the bar, his behavior more focused than it had been the previous evening. He positioned himself behind the long mahogany counter and began scratching at a section of the wooden floor with deliberate intensity. The sound echoed in the empty saloon like a woodpecker, working a particularly stubborn tree. Ray poured himself coffee from the thermos he'd brought and watched the dog work. It wasn't random scratching. Duke was targeting a specific area about 3 feet behind the bar, near where the floor met the back wall. The floorboards there looked no different from any others, weathered pine that had probably been installed when the saloon was built. But Duke seemed convinced there was something underneath worth his attention. "You're going to wear your claws down to nothing," Ray said, but the dog paid him no mind. If anything, Duke's efforts became more determined, accompanied by occasional whines of frustration. Ray spent the morning exploring the rest of the property, trying to get a sense of what exactly he'd inherited. The stable behind the saloon was beyond saving, its roof caved in, and walls leaning at angles that defied basic engineering. The small house was in better shape, but still needed more work than Ray was interested in tackling. Every time he returned to the main building, Duke was in the same spot, scratching at the same section of floor. By afternoon, Ray's curiosity was getting the better of his common sense. He drove into what passed for the business district of Cedar Flats and bought a crowbar and hammer from the general store. The proprietor, a wispy man named Coleman, who looked like he'd been running the place since statehood, asked no questions, but watched with interested eyes as Ray loaded his purchases into the truck. "Fixing up the lucky strike?" Coleman asked. "Something like that," Ray replied, not sure himself what he was planning to do. Back at the saloon, Duke was still at his post, though his scratching had taken on a more desperate quality. Ray knelt beside the dog and examined the floorboards more carefully. Now that he was looking for it, he could see subtle differences in the wood grain, as if this section had been cut and replaced at some point. The boards were secured with square-headed nails that looked newer than the others, though newer was probably relative in a building this old. "Well, Duke," Ray said, working the crowbar under the edge of the first board, "if we're going to tear up somebody else's floor, we might as well do it right." The nails came up easier than expected, suggesting the boards had been removed and replaced before. As Ray lifted the first plank, Duke's whining intensified, and the dog paced back and forth as if he could barely contain his excitement. Underneath, the floor was nothing but dirt and the musty smell of earth that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Ray removed 2 more boards, creating a hole about 3 feet square. He was beginning to think this was a waste of time when his crowbar struck something that definitely wasn't dirt. Scraping away the loose soil with his hands, he uncovered the corner of what looked like a metal box. "I'll be damned," he muttered. And Duke barked once, sharp and triumphant. It took another hour of careful digging to uncover the entire container, a steel ammunition box, the kind used by the military to store everything from bullets to emergency rations. The metal was corroded but intact, and the latch still worked despite years underground. Ray's hands were shaking slightly as he lifted the box out of its hiding place and set it on the bar. Duke sat perfectly still, watching as Ray opened the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were documents, lots of them. Ray unwrapped the bundle carefully, aware that whatever he was looking at had been important enough for someone to bury under the floor of a saloon. The first item was a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age, but still legible. Ray opened it randomly and found himself looking at what appeared to be mining records. Dates, locations, assay results, and calculations written in a careful hand. The entries went back to the 1880s and continued sporadically through the 1960s. Underneath the ledger were maps, hand-drawn surveys that showed the area around Cedar Flats in remarkable detail, with elevation markers, geological formations, and what looked like mining claims marked in different colored inks. One map in particular caught Ray's attention. It showed the land around the saloon, but with boundaries and features that didn't match what he'd seen driving around the property. At the bottom of the box, wrapped separately in a piece of waterproof cloth, was a folder containing typed documents. Ray opened it to find copies of mining claims, geological surveys, and correspondence between various companies and government agencies. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the paperwork: McAllister Lode. Ray had never heard the term before, but based on the documents, the McAllister Lode was a gold vein that had been discovered in the 1880s during the Montana Gold Rush. According to the geological surveys, it was potentially one of the richest strikes in the territory, but the original mining operation had been shut down due to what the official reports called technical difficulties and financial constraints. The correspondence told a different story. Letters between mining engineers, railroad executives, and territorial officials suggested that the real problem wasn't technical or financial, it was political. Someone with influence had wanted the mining. Operations stopped, and they'd succeeded in burying not just the operation, but any record of its true potential. As Ray read through the documents, the scope of what he was looking at began to sink in. Modern geological estimates put the potential value of the McAllister Lode at somewhere between $50 and $100 million, assuming the vein could be located and accessed. And according to the maps in the box, a significant portion of the lode ran directly underneath the land he'd just inherited. Duke had been watching him read, and now the dog moved closer, resting his chin on Ray's knee. Ray scratched behind the shepherd's ears absently, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd discovered. If these documents were accurate, he wasn't looking at inheriting a run-down saloon in the middle of nowhere. He was looking at inheriting a potential fortune, but as he continued reading, other details began to emerge that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Several of the letters mentioned incidents involving people who had gotten too close to the truth about the McAllister Lode. Mining engineers who had suffered mysterious accidents, surveyors who had disappeared without a trace, and at least one territorial official who had died under questionable circumstances. The most recent documents in the folder were dated just 3 years ago. Someone had been conducting new surveys of the area using modern equipment and techniques to verify the old geological reports. The surveys confirmed what the 1880s miners had suspected. The McAllister Lode was real, and it was enormous. At the very bottom of the folder was a handwritten note on Lucky Strike Saloon letterhead. Ray recognized the writing from the ledger entries, presumably Uncle Jeremiah's hand. If you're reading this, it means I was right to be worried. They know about the lode, and they know I know. Duke will show you where to look, but be careful. Who you trust. The Blackstone family has been after this land for 3 generations, and they're not going to stop now. The real maps are in the stable, behind the 3rd post from the north wall. Tell Martha I'm sorry I couldn't say goodbye. Ray read the note 3 times, his coffee growing cold as the implications settled in. Uncle Jeremiah hadn't just disappeared, he'd been running from something, or someone, and whatever had happened to him might not be finished. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the boarded windows. Duke whined softly and moved closer to Ray, as if sensing the change in mood that had come with the discovery. Ray carefully rewrapped the documents and placed them back in the ammunition box, but left it open on the bar. As if responding to his thoughts, the phone rang. Ray stared at the ancient rotary telephone mounted on the wall behind the bar, its shrill ring seeming impossibly loud in the empty saloon. He hadn't even known the phone was connected, let alone that anyone had the number. After 5 rings, he picked up the receiver. "Hello, Mr. Dobbs." The voice was smooth, professional, with just a hint of an accent Ray couldn't place. "My name is Marcus Blackstone. I represent a development company that's very interested in your property. I wonder if we might arrange a meeting to discuss a purchase offer." Ray looked down at the ammunition box, then at Duke, who was growling, low in his throat. "I haven't decided whether I'm selling." "Oh, I think you'll find our offer very generous," Blackstone said, and there was something in his tone that suggested the conversation was more than a simple business inquiry. "Tomorrow morning would be convenient for us. Shall we say 10 o'clock? The line went dead before Ray could respond. He hung up the phone and stood in the gathering dusk, rain drumming harder against the windows. Duke had stopped growling, but his ears were still alert, and he kept looking toward the front door as if he expected unwelcome visitors. Ray closed the ammunition box and carried it upstairs, Duke following close behind. Whatever Uncle Jeremiah had gotten himself into, it looked like Ray was about to inherit more than just property. He was inheriting a mystery that someone was willing to kill for, and a secret that had been buried for more than a century. As he settled the box under his bed, Ray found himself wondering if Duke's scratching hadn't been about finding something after all. Maybe it had been about warning him that something was about to find him. Ray spent the night spread eagle on his sleeping bag, the contents of the ammunition box arranged around him like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Duke lay beside him, occasionally lifting his head to listen to sounds that Ray couldn't hear, the settling of old wood, or maybe something more deliberate moving around outside. The railroad survey maps were the most intriguing documents in the collection, hand-drawn on heavy paper that had somehow survived over a century underground. They showed the planned route of the Northern Pacific Railroad through this part of Montana, but these weren't the maps that had guided the actual construction. Ray could tell, because the railroad that had eventually been built ran 15 miles north of Cedar Flats, while these maps showed tracks running right through the heart of what was now his property. Someone had changed the railroad's route, and according to the notes scrawled in the margins, that someone had done it specifically to avoid disturbing the McAllister Lode. The question was whether they'd wanted to protect the gold or claim it for themselves. By first light, Ray had made two decisions. First, he was going to learn everything he could about the McAllister Lode before Marcus Blackstone arrived for their unwanted meeting. Second, he was going to find those additional maps that Uncle Jeremiah had hidden in the stable. The Cedar Flats Public Library occupied half of a building that also housed the post office and what optimistically called itself the Chamber of Commerce. Ray arrived as Agnes Kowalski was unlocking the front door, a task that required 3 different keys and what sounded like a detailed knowledge of the building's various architectural quirks. Agnes was exactly what Ray had expected a small-town librarian to be, somewhere between 60 and 80, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and glasses that spent more time hanging from a chain around her neck than actually on her face. What he hadn't expected was the way her eyes lit up when he mentioned the McAllister Lode. "Well, I'll be," she said, settling behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single enormous tree. "Nobody's asked about that particular piece of history in years. Most folks around here have forgotten all about it, but you haven't." Agnes smiled and pulled a thick folder from a filing cabinet that probably predated the Eisenhower administration. "My grandfather worked the original mining operation back in 81 and 82. Used to tell stories about that summer when half the territory thought they were going to strike it rich right here in Cedar Flats." Ray leaned forward as Agnes opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. "What happened to shut it down?" "Depends on who you ask," Agnes said, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper that librarians reserved for their best stories. "Official version is that the investors ran out of money and the geological surveys proved inconclusive. But my grandfather always said they found exactly what they were looking for. They just found some other things they weren't expecting." She pulled out a photograph that showed a group of men standing in front of what looked like a mine entrance. The clothing and equipment suggested the 1880s, and Ray could see the optimism in their faces, men who believed they were about to change their fortunes forever. "That's the entrance to the McAllister mine," Agnes said, pointing to a dark opening in what looked like a hillside. "According to my grandfather, they pulled enough gold out of there in 2 months to buy half of Montana. But then something happened that made them seal it up and pretend it never existed." "What kind of something?" Agnes hesitated, studying Ray's face as if trying to determine how much truth he could handle. "My grandfather never said directly, but he hinted that some very powerful people had decided the gold belonged to them, regardless of who owned the land or held the mining rights. When the original miners wouldn't sell out, they started having accidents. Ray thought about Uncle Jeremiah's note and the mention of the Blackstone family. What can you tell me about a family named Blackstone? The change in Agnes's expression was immediate and unmistakable. Where there had been enthusiasm for local history, now there was something much more cautious. The Blackstones have been buying up land around here for decades, she said carefully. Always seem to know which properties are going to become valuable before anyone else does. You sound like you don't think that's a coincidence. Agnes closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. Mr. Dobbs, I've lived in this county for 67 years. In that time, I've seen a lot of people sell their land to the Blackstone Development Company, usually right after they started having trouble with equipment failures, mysterious fires, or visits from government inspectors they never called. Ray felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Has anyone ever tried to fight them? A few have tried. Agnes's voice was barely above a whisper now. Your uncle was one of them. What happened to him? Same thing that happens to anyone who gets between the Blackstones and something they want. He disappeared. Agnes stood up abruptly, the interview clearly over. Be careful, Mr. Dobbs. Some stories are better left buried. Ray drove back to the saloon with Agnes's warning echoing in his head and a photocopy of the mining photograph tucked into his shirt pocket. The original mine entrance in the picture was somewhere on or near his property, but finding it after 140 years wasn't going to be easy. According to the library's geological survey maps, the entire area had been altered by decades of erosion, development, and deliberate landscaping. The stable behind the saloon was in even worse condition than Ray had remembered. The roof had collapsed in several places, and what remained of the structure leaned heavily on a series of wooden posts that looked like they were held up more by habit than engineering principles. Ray counted from the north wall and found the third post, a massive beam that had probably been cut from a tree older than the territory itself. Behind the post, Uncle Jeremiah had carved out a hiding place that was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The space contained another oiled canvas bundle, this one holding maps that made the railroad surveys look like rough sketches. These were detailed topographical charts showing every hill, stream, and rock formation within a 5-mile radius of Cedar Flats. More importantly, they showed the exact location of the McAllister mine entrance, along with a network of tunnels that honeycombed the ground underneath Ray's property. According to these maps, the mine wasn't a single tunnel, but an extensive underground complex with multiple entrances and several large chambers where the miners had followed the gold vein deeper into the earth. Uncle Jeremiah had marked the maps with modern notations, indicating which passages were likely still stable and which had probably collapsed over the decades. Ray was so absorbed in studying the maps that he almost didn't notice the sound of vehicles approaching the saloon. By the time he looked up, 2 black SUVs were pulling into the gravel parking area, their tinted windows and aggressive styling making them look distinctly out of place in the rural setting. Duke had heard them coming and was already positioned. At the stable door, his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in his throat. Ray quickly rewrapped the maps and tucked them inside his jacket, then stepped out to meet his visitors. Marcus Blackstone was exactly what Ray had expected. Tall, expensively dressed, with the kind of confident smile that usually meant someone was about to lose their shirt. He was accompanied by 2 men who looked less like business associates and more like the kind of people you hired when the business associates weren't getting results. Mr. Dobbs, Blackstone said, extending a hand that Ray didn't take. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I didn't agree to anything, Ray replied. You said you'd be here, and here you are. Blackstone's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Direct. I appreciate that in a man. It makes negotiations so much more efficient. He gestured toward the saloon. Shall we discuss this inside? Ray glanced at the 2 men flanking Blackstone, noting the way they positioned themselves to block his access to the truck. Duke had moved closer, still growling, and Ray could feel the tension radiating from the dog like heat from a fire. We can talk right here, Ray said. I'm guessing this won't take long. Oh, I think you'll find our offer quite compelling, Blackstone said, pulling a folded document from his jacket. $5 million for the property, including all buildings and contents, cash, with closing scheduled for next week. Ray took the document, but didn't unfold it. $5 million was more. Money than he'd see in 3 lifetimes, but something about the offer felt wrong. Not the amount, the urgency. Why was Blackstone so anxious to close the deal quickly? That's generous, Ray said carefully, but I'm not ready to make any decisions yet. I just inherited this place. I'd like some time to think about what I want to do with it. The change in Blackstone's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The friendly businessman facade slipped just enough to reveal something much harder underneath. Mr. Dobbs, I hope you understand that opportunities like this don't come along often. Property values in rural areas can be quite volatile, and there are so many things that can affect the value of a place like this. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't quite not a threat either. Ray looked at the 2 men standing behind Blackstone, then at Duke, who had stopped growling but was coiled like a spring, ready to be released. I appreciate the offer, Ray said, handing the document back unsigned. When I'm ready to sell, I'll let you know. Blackstone took the document, his smile now completely gone. Of course, but Mr. Dobbs, I do hope you'll consider the practical aspects of your situation. This is a very isolated area, and accidents can happen so easily to older properties. Insurance companies are notoriously difficult about paying claims on buildings this old. This time, there was no mistaking the threat. Ray felt his jaw tighten, but before he could respond, Duke moved between him and Blackstone, the dog's massive frame suddenly seeming twice as large as normal. I'll keep that in mind, Ray said quietly. Now I think you should leave. Blackstone nodded to his companions, and they began moving toward their vehicles. We'll be in touch, Mr. Dobbs. I have a feeling we'll be seeing each other again very soon. Ray stood in the gravel lot long after the SUVs disappeared down the dirt road. Duke pressed against his leg, and both of them listening to the echo of expensive engines fading into the distance. He looked down at the dog, whose brown eyes seemed to hold a warning as clear as any words. I think we're in trouble, boy, Ray said, and Duke's tail thumped once against his leg. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement that trouble was something they'd face together. Ray found the business card tucked under his windshield wiper the next morning. Pristine white cardstock that seemed to glow against the dusty glass. Marcus Blackstone, Senior Partner, Blackstone Development, turning vision into reality. Below the slogan was a phone number with a Helena area code and an email address that ended in .bsd, which Ray figured was probably some kind of private corporate domain. He held the card up to the morning light, noting the expensive paper and raised lettering. Everything about it screamed money and power, from the subtle watermark to the way it felt substantial in his fingers. It was the kind of business card that was designed to impress, to make people believe they were dealing with someone important. Duke sniffed the card with obvious distaste, then looked up at Ray with an expression that clearly communicated his opinion of uninvited visitors who left calling cards. I know, boy, Ray said, tucking the card into his shirt pocket. But keep your enemies close, right? The morning was crisp, with the kind of clarity that only came after a good rain had washed the dust out of the air. Ray spent an hour walking the boundaries of his property, trying to match the terrain to the maps he'd found in the stable. The land was larger than he'd initially realized, extending back into the hills behind the saloon and including several acres of what looked like natural pasture. It was while he was examining what might have been an old mining trail that he noticed the tire tracks, fresh ones made since yesterday's rain, leading from the main road to a spot about a quarter-mile from the saloon. Someone had been on his property during the night, and they'd made no effort to hide the evidence. Ray followed the tracks to a cleared area where the vehicle had been parked for some time, based on the oil stains and cigarette butts scattered in the dirt. Whoever had been here had brought equipment. He could see the impressions left by tripod legs and what looked like the base of some kind of surveying instrument. "Well, that didn't take long," he muttered, and Duke barked once in agreement. The sound of an approaching truck sent both man and dog back toward the saloon at a quick pace. Ray relaxed when he recognized Martha's battered pickup, but his hand still moved instinctively toward the knife on his belt. After yesterday's visit from Blackstone, he wasn't taking any chances. Martha climbed out of her truck, carrying a casserole dish that smelled like it contained something involving beef and potatoes. She was dressed for work. Jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. But there was something in her expression that suggested this wasn't a purely social visit. "Thought you might be getting tired of eating whatever you brought with you," she said, handing him the dish. "Also thought we should have a conversation about your visitors yesterday." Ray accepted the casserole gratefully, realizing he hadn't eaten anything more substantial than coffee and stale crackers in the past 24 hours. Word travels fast around here. In a town this size, everything travels fast, Martha said, settling herself on the saloon's front steps. Marcus Blackstone and his boys made quite an impression at the general store. Coleman said they asked a lot of questions about you and your property. "What kind of questions?" Martha's expression darkened. "The kind that make a person wonder. If maybe they should have stayed in bed this morning. They wanted to know how long you'd been here, whether you seemed like the type to stick around, and if anyone had seen you poking around in places you shouldn't be poking around." Ray sat down beside her, Duke settling himself between them like a furry guardian. "Martha, what do you know about the Blackstone family?" "More than I'd like to," she said quietly. "They've been buying up land in this county for the better part of 30 years. Always cash offers, always well above market value, and always right after the current owners start having what you might call bad luck." "What kind of bad luck?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle high overhead. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much to dismiss as coincidence. Tom Henderson owned the spread just north of here. Good rancher, had been working that land for 40 years. Last spring his well suddenly went dry. Then his barn burned down. Electrical fire, according to the insurance company, though Tom swore he'd just had the wiring checked. After that, he started having problems with government inspectors showing up, claiming his operation was in violation of environmental regulations that nobody had ever heard of before. Did he sell? Finally had to. Blackstone Development made him an offer he couldn't afford to refuse, especially after his cattle started getting sick from some kind of contamination they could never quite identify. Martha turned to look at Ray directly. "Tom's not the only one. 3 other families. In the past 5 years, all with similar stories." Ray felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "And my uncle, Jeremiah, was the first one to really fight them. He hired lawyers, filed complaints with the state, even got some environmental groups interested in what was happening here. For a while, it looked like he might actually cause them some real trouble. What changed? He disappeared." Martha's voice was flat, emotionless. "One day he was here talking about taking his fight all the way to Washington if he had to. Next day, his truck was found abandoned on the highway 50 miles from here, keys still in the ignition, and his wallet on the seat. Never found any sign of him after that." Ray pulled out the business card and showed it to Martha. "This was on my truck this morning." Martha examined the card carefully, then handed it back with a disgusted expression. "Same card Tom Henderson got. Same card all of them got right before their troubles started getting serious. Any idea what they're really after? Had to be something valuable to go to all this trouble. Jeremiah thought it was connected to the old mining claims from the 1880s, but he never told me exactly what he'd found." Martha looked toward the saloon, then back at Ray. "Did he leave you anything besides the building?" Ray hesitated. Martha had been helpful, and her obvious affection for Uncle Jeremiah suggested she could be trusted. But Agnes's warnings about being careful who he trusted were still fresh in his mind. "Some old papers," he said finally. "Nothing that makes much sense." Yet if Martha noticed his evasion, she didn't comment on it. Instead, she stood and brushed dust from her jeans. "Well, whatever it is, you need to be careful. The Blackstone family doesn't give up easy, and they've got more resources than most folks around here can fight." "Are you telling me I should take their offer?" Martha considered the question seriously. "I'm telling you that if you decide to fight them, you'd better be sure you know what you're fighting for. And you'd better be sure you can win, because if you can't, you might end up like Jeremiah." After Martha left, Ray spent the afternoon researching Blackstone development on the ancient computer in the Cedar Flats library. What he found was a company that specialized in land acquisition and mineral rights, with projects spanning several western states. Their website was professionally designed, but surprisingly vague about their actual operations. Lots of photos of smiling executives and restored landscapes, but very little concrete information about what they actually did with the land they acquired. More interesting was what he found in the local newspaper archives. Over the past 10 years, Blackstone development had been mentioned in connection with several environmental lawsuits, all of which had been settled out of court with sealed agreements that prevented the details from becoming public. There were also several articles about Marcus Blackstone Sr., who had apparently been just as aggressive in his business practices before handing control of the company to his son. By evening, Ray had made a decision. Whatever Uncle Jeremiah had found, whatever the Blackstones wanted, he wasn't going to roll over and hand it to them. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the memory of his uncle's face in that faded photograph. Or maybe it was just the principle of the thing. But he was going to find out what was buried under his property, and he was going to do it before Marcus Blackstone could make good on his implied threats. Duke seemed to sense the change in Ray's mood. The dog had been restless all day, pacing between the windows and occasionally growling at sounds only he could hear. As darkness fell, he positioned himself by the front door, ears alert and muscles tense. "You hear something, boy?" Ray asked, but Duke just whined softly and continued his vigil. Ray checked the locks on all the doors and windows, then settled into the least uncomfortable chair in the saloon's main room, with Uncle Jeremiah's maps spread across a nearby table. By lamplight, the underground tunnel system looked even more extensive than he'd first realized. If the maps were accurate, there were at least 3 entrances to the mine complex, and several of the larger chambers showed evidence of significant gold extraction. The question was whether any of it was still accessible after more than a century. Cave-ins, flooding, and simple structural decay could have made the whole system impassable. But if even a small portion of the tunnels remained stable, and if the McAllister Lode still contained anything close to what the original surveys suggested, Ray was sitting on top of enough money to buy and sell Marcus Blackstone several times over. Around midnight, Duke's low growl woke Ray from an uneasy doze. The dog was at the window, staring into the darkness beyond the porch. Ray moved quietly to the window and peered out, but could see nothing beyond the reach of the porch light. Then he heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, too deliberate to be an animal. Someone was moving around outside the saloon, trying to stay out of sight but not quite succeeding. Ray reached for the shotgun he'd retrieved from Uncle Jeremiah's bedroom closet, checking to make sure it was loaded. Duke was pressed against his leg, every muscle coiled for action, but waiting for Ray's signal. The footsteps circled the building once, then stopped. Ray waited, counting his heartbeats and listening for any sound that might indicate what the intruder was planning. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, he heard the sound of a vehicle starting up somewhere in the distance. Whoever it was, they're gone now, he whispered to Duke, but the dog remained alert for another hour before finally settling down. Ray didn't sleep much for the rest of the night. Every small sound, the settling of old wood, the scurry of some small animal in the walls, the sigh of wind through the broken shingles, seemed amplified and potentially threatening. By morning, he'd made another decision. It was time to stop reacting to Marcus Blackstone's moves and start making some moves of his own. If there was gold under his property, he was going to find it. And if the Blackstone family thought they could intimidate him into selling, they were about to learn that some old cowboys were harder to scare than others. The attic access was hidden behind a loose board in the upstairs hallway, so well concealed that Ray might never have found it if Duke hadn't started scratching at the wall with the same persistence he'd shown with the floorboards downstairs. The opening was barely wide enough for Ray's shoulders, but once he squeezed through, he found himself in a space that Uncle Jeremiah had clearly used as more than just storage. The attic ran the length of the building, with enough headroom for a tall man to stand upright in the center. Boxes and trunks lined the walls, but what caught Ray's attention was a small desk positioned under the single window that faced east toward the hills. Papers were scattered across its surface, and a kerosene lamp sat nearby, its glass chimney blackened from use. Ray lit the lamp and settled into the wooden chair behind the desk. The papers were covered with his uncle's handwriting, the same careful script he'd seen in the mining ledgers, but these were personal notes, observations, and what looked like journal entries dating back several years. The first entry he picked up was dated 3 years earlier, April 15th, found Ray's father's letters in the old trunk today. Still can't believe how stubborn we both were, how we let pride turn brothers into strangers. Charlie was right about the Blackstone family, though I was too pig-headed to admit it at the time. They've been circling this land like vultures for 30 years, and now I understand why. If the old surveys are right, the McAllister Lode runs right under this property. Charlie tried to warn me, but I thought he was just being paranoid. Should have listened to my little brother. Ray set the paper down carefully, his hands shaking slightly. His father had known about the gold, had known about the Blackstones. The family arguments he remembered from his childhood suddenly took on a different meaning. They hadn't been about old grudges and stubborn pride. They'd been about something much more dangerous. He found another entry, this one dated 6 months later, October 3rd. Marcus Blackstone came by again today, this time with a lawyer and what he called a final offer. $5 million for the property with a closing date next month. When I told him I wasn't interested, he got that look in his eyes, the same look his grandfather used to get when someone crossed him. The Blackstones don't handle rejection well. I've been doing research into the family history, and the pattern goes back 3 generations. They identify valuable land, make generous offers, and when those offers are refused, the current owners start having accidents. Charlie was right to be scared of them. Ray felt a chill as he realized the same offer Uncle Jeremiah had refused was exactly what Marcus Blackstone had offered him. The same amount, the same urgency, probably even the same thinly veiled threats. More entries followed, documenting Uncle Jeremiah's growing understanding of the conspiracy surrounding the McAllister Lode. November 20th. Talked to Agnes at the library today. She showed me her grandfather's mining journals from 1882. The original operation extracted over $2 million worth of gold in just 3 months, using 1880s technology and methods. Modern estimates suggest they barely scratched the surface. The main vein runs for miles underground, and according to the geological surveys I've been studying, it's one of the richest deposits ever discovered in Montana. No wonder the Blackstones have been so patient. December 1st. Found evidence that Marcus Blackstone's great-grandfather was involved in shutting down the original mining operation. Railroad records show that Edmund Blackstone was on the board of directors for the Northern Pacific when they decided to route the railroad away from Cedar Flats. He claimed it was for engineering reasons, but I think he wanted to keep the area isolated so his family could control access to the gold. They've been playing a long game, waiting for the right opportunity to claim what they've always believed belongs to them. Ray paused in his reading, remembering the railroad survey maps he'd found in the hidden compartment. The pieces were starting to fit together. The Blackstone family hadn't just stumbled across information about the McAllister Lode. They'd been involved in covering it up from the very beginning, preserving it for their own eventual exploitation. The journal entries became more urgent as they progressed. January 14th. They're getting bolder. Someone broke into the saloon last night while I was visiting Martha. Nothing was taken, but they went through my papers. They know I've been researching the Lode, and they know I'm not going to sell. I've started hiding the most important documents, just in case something happens to me. February 2nd. Duke saved my life today. I was checking the fence line behind the stable when I heard a rifle shot. The bullet went right where my head would have been if Duke hadn't knocked me down to investigate something in the brush. Hunting accident, according to the sheriff, but there's no hunting season for anything right now, and the shot came from private property. I'm not a paranoid man, but I'm starting to think Charlie was right about what happens to people who get in the Blackstone's way. Ray's throat tightened as he read about his father. Charlie Dobbs had apparently understood the danger long before Uncle Jeremiah had been willing to admit it. The family arguments, Ray remembered, hadn't been about pride or old grudges. They'd been about fear. His father had been trying to protect his brother, and Uncle Jeremiah had been too stubborn to listen. The final entries were the most disturbing. March 10th. Marcus Blackstone called today with what he described as his absolutely final offer. When I refused again, he made it clear that my choice was to sell voluntarily or have the property taken from me one way or another. He mentioned that accidents happen to aging men living alone in remote areas, especially those who weren't. Careful about gas leaks, electrical fires, and steep stairs. I've decided to write everything down and hide it where someone will eventually find it. If something happens to me, at least the truth will survive. On March 15th, I've been thinking about Ray, Charlie's boy, the one who was too proud to stay for his father's funeral. I was angry with him then, thought he was disrespectful and ungrateful, but maybe Charlie raised him right after all. Maybe he'll be stubborn enough to fight when the time comes. I'm changing my will. If the Blackstones get me, maybe Ray will get them. The last entry was dated just 2 weeks before Uncle Jeremiah's disappearance. March 22nd. They're closing in. Someone's been watching the saloon at night, and my phone's been making strange noises like it's tapped. I've hidden the maps and most of the documentation, but I've kept copies of everything in case I need to bargain. Duke knows where to find what matters. That dog's smarter than most people give him credit for. If something happens to me, he'll show Ray what he needs to know. I just hope the boy's smart enough to listen to an old dog and a dead man's warning. Ray sat back in the chair, the journal entries scattered around him, like evidence in a cold case file. Uncle Jeremiah hadn't just disappeared. He'd been murdered for his refusal to sell to the Blackstone family, and now they expected Ray to make the same choice his uncle had refused. Duke had somehow made his way up to the attic and was sitting beside the desk, watching Ray with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog seemed to understand the significance of what Ray had discovered, and there was something in his expression that looked almost like approval. He knew this would happen, didn't he? Ray asked, and Duke's tail thumped once against the floor. Ray gathered up the journal entries carefully, adding them to the growing collection of evidence against the Blackstone family. But as he prepared to climb back down to the main floor, he noticed something else on the desk, a small leather-bound address book, its pages filled with names and phone numbers. Most of the entries were local: Martha, Agnes, various business, contacts in Helena and Billings, but several names stood out, people with addresses in Washington, D.C., Denver, and San Francisco. Environmental lawyers, investigative journalists, mining engineers, and what looked like contacts in several federal agencies. Uncle Jeremiah hadn't just been researching the McAllister Lode, he'd been building a network of allies who could help him fight the Blackstone family's influence. These were people who specialized in taking on corporations that thought they were too powerful to challenge. Ray tucked the address book into his jacket pocket, along with the most important journal. Entries. Uncle Jeremiah had died trying to protect this land and expose the truth about the Blackstone conspiracy. Ray wasn't going to let that sacrifice be in vain. As he climbed down from the attic, Duke following close behind, Ray felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond just his own survival. This wasn't just about inheriting property or even finding gold. This was about finishing what his uncle had started, about standing up to bullies who thought they could terrorize people into submission, and about proving that sometimes the good guys could still win if they were stubborn enough to keep fighting. Uncle Jeremiah had been right about one thing. Ray was stubborn enough to fight when the time came. The question was whether he was smart enough to win. The harassment started small, the way these things always do. Ray's truck wouldn't start Monday morning, and when he popped the hood, he found his battery cables had been loosened just enough to break the connection. Tuesday brought a dead phone line, the cable cut cleanly with wire cutters and left hanging where he'd be sure to find it. Wednesday, someone had driven across his front pasture during the night, leaving deep tire ruts that would have cost hundreds of dollars to repair if Ray had been the type to care about perfectly manicured grass. By Thursday, Ray was expecting trouble, which is probably why he noticed the surveyor's tripod positioned on the ridge overlooking his property. Through binoculars borrowed from Martha, he could see two men with expensive equipment taking measurements and photos of his land. When he drove up the hill to confront them, they packed up quickly and disappeared in a truck with no license plates. Duke had become increasingly agitated as the week progressed, pacing the perimeter of the property and growling at sounds that Ray couldn't hear. The dog's behavior reminded Ray of a guard animal protecting territory, except the threat wasn't wolves or bears. It was something much more dangerous. Friday morning brought the kind of official harassment that was harder to dismiss as coincidence. A knock on the door revealed a man in a county uniform claiming to be a building inspector, complete with clipboard and officious manner. "Ray Dobbs," the inspector asked, consulting his paperwork. "I'm here about complaints regarding the structural integrity of this building. We've received reports that it may be unsafe for habitation." Ray looked at the man's identification carefully. The photo matched, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. What kind of complaints? Anonymous tips about foundation problems, electrical hazards, possible asbestos contamination. "I'm going to need to do a complete inspection of the premises." The inspector was already moving toward the door, as if Ray's permission wasn't required. "Not without a warrant, you're not," Ray said, stepping into the doorway. Duke materialized beside him, hackles raised and teeth visible. The inspector's professional demeanor slipped slightly. "Sir, this is a routine safety inspection. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to file a report recommending immediate condemnation of the property." "File whatever you want," Ray replied, "but you're not setting foot in this building without proper legal documentation." The inspector left, but not before making a show of photographing the exterior of the saloon and taking notes about obvious structural deficiencies and clear safety violations. Ray watched him drive away, noting that the county vehicle's license plate was obscured by mud that looked like it had been applied deliberately. That afternoon, Ray drove into Cedar Flats to visit Agnes at the library, carrying a specific question and a growing sense of urgency. If the Blackstones were escalating their pressure campaign, he needed to understand exactly what legal ground he was standing on. "Agnes," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "I need to see the original property records for the Lucky Strike Saloon, not the modern surveys, the original territorial land grants from when the property was first established." Agnes looked up from her cataloguing with interest. "Going back to the beginning, are we? That's smart thinking. Modern property records can be altered or misinterpreted, but the original territorial grants are maintained in the state archives." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a thick folder that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. "These are copies of the original documents filed with the territorial government in 1881. Your property was established as part of a mining claim that included mineral rights in perpetuity." Ray opened the folder carefully, aware that he was looking at documents that predated Montana statehood. The paperwork was handwritten on heavy paper that had yellowed with age. But the legal language was clear enough. The original land grant included not just the surface property where the saloon sat, but underground mineral rights extending in all directions from the central claim marker. More importantly, the boundaries described in the original grant were significantly different from the modern property lines shown on current surveys. According to the 1881 documentation, Ray's property extended almost twice as far in every direction, including areas that were now supposedly owned by neighboring ranchers and, according to recent real estate records, by Blackstone Development. Agnes, Ray said slowly, if these original boundaries are legally valid, it means my property includes land that other people think they own. That's exactly what it means, Agnes confirmed. Territorial land grants supersede later surveys unless they've been officially modified through proper legal channels. And from what I can see here, there's no record of any boundary modifications ever being filed. Ray felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. If the original property boundaries were still legally valid, he owned not just the land around the saloon, but potentially the entire area where the McAllister Lode was located. It also meant that Marcus Blackstone's recent land acquisitions might be worthless if they were based on incorrect modern surveys. There's something else, Agnes said, pulling another document from the folder. The original deed includes a provision that's pretty unusual for territorial land grants. It specifically states that mineral rights cannot be sold separately from the surface property and that any attempt to claim mineral rights through adjacent properties is null and void. Ray studied the clause Agnes was pointing to, written in the formal legal language of the 1880s, but clear in its intent. Whoever had written the original land grant had been thinking ahead, protecting not just the current claim holder, but future owners from the kind of mineral rights manipulation that was common in mining country. Why would they include a provision like that? Ray asked. Because they knew what they had, Agnes said quietly. The McAllister Lode wasn't just another mining claim, it was potentially the richest gold deposit in the territory. The original claim holders wanted to make sure that no one could use legal tricks to steal what they'd found. Ray made copies of the original deed and related documents, paying for the service with exact change, and trying to appear casual about what was potentially the most important paperwork he'd ever handled. As he prepared to leave, Agnes caught his arm. Mr. Dobbs, you need to be very careful with this information. If the Blackstone family has been buying up land based on modern surveys that don't take the original territorial grants into account, you've just discovered that their investments might be worthless. That makes you extremely dangerous to them. That evening, Ray sat at the bar in the Lucky Strike Saloon, the original deed spread out before him alongside Uncle Jeremiah's maps and the modern property surveys he'd obtained from the county clerk's office. The discrepancies were even more dramatic when he compared all three documents side by side. According to the original territorial grant, the McAllister mining claim extended from the saloon property in all directions for nearly 2 miles. The modern surveys showed the same area divided among more than a dozen different property owners, with Blackstone Development controlling about 60% of the total area through recent purchases. But if the original deed was still legally valid, and Agnes seemed confident that it was, then all of those modern property transfers were based on incorrect boundary information. Ray didn't just own a rundown saloon and a few acres of land. He owned the entire McAllister Lode, and Marcus Blackstone had just spent several $1 million buying land that didn't legally belong to the people who sold it to him. Duke seemed to sense the significance of Ray's discovery. The dog had positioned himself beside the bar, alert and watchful, as if he understood that the documents spread across the mahogany surface represented both opportunity and danger. Ray's phone rang, the harsh sound startling in the quiet saloon. He answered cautiously, expecting another threatening call from Marcus Blackstone. Instead, he heard Martha's voice, tight with worry. "Ray, you need to get over here right now. Someone just tried to burn down my barn." Ray was in his truck and driving toward Martha's place before the phone call ended, Duke riding shotgun, and both of them understanding that the stakes had just been raised considerably. The harassment campaign was escalating, and Martha had been targeted because of her association with him. As he drove through the darkness, headlights cutting through the Montana night, Ray made a decision that Uncle Jeremiah would have approved of. He wasn't going to wait for the Blackstones to make the next move. It was time to take the fight to them, using the one weapon they didn't know he possessed. The truth about who really owned the McAllister Lode, the original deed tucked safely in his jacket pocket, felt like a loaded gun, dangerous to possess, but potentially the only thing that could save him. Tomorrow, he would start making phone calls to the names in Uncle Jeremiah's address book. Environmental lawyers, investigative journalists, federal agents, people who specialized in taking down criminals who thought they were too powerful to touch. The Blackstone family had been playing a long game for 3 generations, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that Ray Dobbs was just another aging cowboy who could be intimidated into submission. They were about to learn that some old cowboys fight back, especially when they're protecting something worth fighting for. Martha's barn hadn't burned down, but it had been a close thing. Ray arrived to find the local volunteer fire department still hosing down the smoldering remains of what had been a hay storage shed attached to the main structure. The acrid smell of gasoline hung heavy in the air, and scorch marks on the barn's west wall told the story of a fire that had been deliberately set and designed to spread. "Started about an hour after dark," Martha said, her face grim in the flashing light of the fire trucks. "Lucky thing I was checking on the horses when I smelled smoke, or I might have lost everything." Ray walked the perimeter of the damage with Martha and Fire Chief Coleman, who turned out to be the general store owner's brother, noting the obvious signs of arson. Empty gas cans had been left behind, and the burn pattern showed multiple ignition points designed to maximize damage. "Professional job," Coleman said quietly. "Whoever did this knew how to set a fire that would spread fast, but looked like it might have been an accident. If Martha hadn't been out here when it started, by the time anyone noticed the flames, the whole barn would have been gone." "Any idea who might have done this?" Ray asked, though he was pretty sure he already knew the answer. Martha and Coleman exchanged a look that suggested they'd been discussing that very question. "Same folks who've been causing trouble for anyone who won't sell their land," Coleman said. "This is the 4th accident this year involving properties that Blackstone Development has made offers on." As the fire trucks were packing up to leave, a sheriff's deputy arrived to take statements. Ray expected the usual rural law enforcement. Approach, take some notes, file a report, promise to investigate when time permitted. Instead, the deputy spent over an hour examining the scene, taking photographs, and asking detailed questions about recent activities on both Martha's property and Ray's. "Deputy Sheriff Rebecca Torres," the officer introduced herself when she finally approached Ray. "I understand you're Jeremiah Dobbs's nephew." "That's right. Did you know my uncle?" Torres nodded slowly. "I was a rookie deputy when he disappeared. That case has always bothered me. And what happened here tonight has some similarities to things that were happening around the time your uncle vanished." Ray felt his attention sharpen. "What kind of similarities?" "Property damage, harassment, threatening phone calls, all targeting people who wouldn't sell their land to the Blackstone family. Your uncle filed several complaints with our office in the months before he disappeared, but my supervisor at the time said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue an investigation." Torres looked around to make sure they couldn't be overheard, then continued in a lower voice. "I've been the investigating officer on 3 similar cases in the past 2 years. Same pattern every time. Property owners refuse to sell. They start having problems, and eventually they either sell or disappear. I think it's time someone took a serious look at the bigger picture." Ray exchanged glances with Martha, both of them understanding that they might have found an ally in law enforcement. What would that involve? Well, officially, I'm just investigating tonight's arson, Torres said. But unofficially, I think it might be worth reopening your uncle's case. There were always questions about what really happened to him, and I've got access to files that weren't available to the public at the time. 3 days later, Ray found himself in the Sheriff's Department conference room, staring at a manila folder that contained everything the county knew about Uncle Jeremiah's disappearance. Deputy Torres had arranged the meeting during her off-duty hours, and she'd made it clear that their conversation was strictly unofficial. The official ruling was voluntary disappearance, Torres explained, opening the file to reveal police reports, photographs, and witness statements. But the investigating officers at the time had serious doubts about that conclusion. Ray leaned forward as Torres spread the contents of the file across the conference table. The first thing that caught his attention was a photograph of Uncle Jeremiah's abandoned truck, found on Highway 287, about 50 miles southeast of Cedar Flats. The vehicle was positioned at an angle on the shoulder, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. "This never made sense to me," Torres said, pointing to the photograph. "If someone was planning to disappear voluntarily, why would they abandon their truck in such an obvious location? And why leave behind their wallet with cash and credit? Card still inside?" Ray studied the crime scene photos, noting details that seemed wrong for a voluntary disappearance. Uncle Jeremiah's coffee cup was on the dashboard, still half full. His reading glasses were on the passenger seat. Most tellingly, his hat was on the ground beside the truck, as if it had fallen off during some kind of struggle. What did the original investigators think happened? Torres pulled out a thick stack of interview notes and reports. There were 2 theories. The official theory, supported by Sheriff Drummond, was that your uncle had gotten into some kind of financial trouble and decided to skip town. The unofficial theory, supported by Detective Morrison, was that something had happened to him. Why the disagreement? "Politics mostly," Torres said with obvious disgust. Sheriff Drummond was up for re-election that year, and the Blackstone family was one of his biggest campaign contributors. Detective Morrison was pushing for a more aggressive investigation, but he was overruled and eventually transferred to another department. Ray felt a chill as the implications sank in. "Are you saying the investigation was deliberately buried?" "I'm saying there were aspects of the case that weren't fully pursued," Torres said carefully. "For instance, several witnesses reported seeing a black SUV following your uncle's truck on the morning he disappeared. But those witness statements were never followed up on, and no attempt was made to identify the vehicle or its occupants." Torres pulled out another set of documents, evidence logs and laboratory reports that Ray had to read twice before their significance became clear. "They found blood in your uncle's truck?" "Small amounts on the driver's seat and door handle. Not enough to indicate a serious injury, but enough to suggest there might have been a struggle. The blood was never DNA tested because Sheriff Drummond ruled it wasn't relevant to a voluntary disappearance case." Ray stared at the evidence report, understanding that what he was looking at was proof that Uncle Jeremiah had been murdered. The blood evidence alone was enough to change the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide, but it had been deliberately overlooked by corrupt officials. "There's more," Torres said, pulling out a folder Ray hadn't noticed before. Detective Morrison kept his own files on the case even after he was transferred. His widow donated them to the Sheriff's Department archives after he died, but they were never officially entered into evidence. The unofficial files contained information that painted a much clearer picture of what had happened to Uncle Jeremiah. Morrison had documented a pattern of harassment targeting several local property owners, all of whom had refused offers from Blackstone Development. Phone records showed threatening calls made to Uncle Jeremiah's number in the weeks before his disappearance. Financial records revealed that Marcus Blackstone's father had made significant payments to local officials around the time the investigation was shut down, Most damning of all was a report that had been suppressed by Sheriff Drummond, a witness. Statement from a truck driver who had seen Uncle Jeremiah's vehicle being forced off the road by two black SUVs on the morning he disappeared. The witness had provided detailed descriptions of the vehicles and their occupants, but his statement had been filed away and forgotten. "Why are you showing me this?" Ray asked, overwhelmed by the evidence of corruption and murder. "Because, Detective, Morrison was my training officer, and he made me promise that if I ever got the chance to pursue this case properly, I would," Torres said. "Also because I think you're in danger. The same people who killed your uncle are still operating, and they're using the same methods against you that they used against him." Ray thought about the harassment he'd been experiencing, the escalating pressure from Marcus Blackstone, and the fire at Martha's barn. The pattern was exactly what Torres had described: systematic intimidation designed to force him into selling or disappearing. "What do you need from me?" Torres leaned back in her chair, considering her answer carefully. "Officially, I can't do anything with this information unless new evidence emerges that justifies reopening the case. Unofficially, if someone were to provide me with evidence that the Blackstone family was currently engaged in criminal activity, I might be able to use these old files to establish a pattern of behavior." Ray understood what she was asking. The evidence he'd found in Uncle Jeremiah's hidden files, combined with the harassment campaign he was currently experiencing, might be enough to build a case against the Blackstone family. But it would require him to risk everything on the assumption that Torres could be trusted to pursue justice, despite the political pressure she would face. "There's something else you should know," Torres said, pulling out the last document in the file. "Marcus Blackstone's father died 3 years ago, but before he died, he allegedly confessed to a Catholic priest about being involved in your uncle's murder. The priest couldn't reveal the details because of confession confidentiality, but he did confirm that the confession took place." Ray stared at the document, a statement from Father Martinez at St. Michael's Church in Helena, confirming that Edmund Blackstone had sought forgiveness for grave sins, including the death of an innocent man. It wasn't legally admissible evidence, but it was moral confirmation that Uncle Jeremiah had been murdered for his refusal to sell his land. "So Marcus Blackstone inherited more than just a development company," Ray said quietly. "He inherited his father's crimes, and apparently his methods," Torres agreed. "The question is whether we can prove it before history repeats itself." Ray made his decision. Uncle Jeremiah had died trying to protect the truth about the McAllister Lode and expose the Blackstone family's criminal activities. Now Ray had the evidence and the allies to finish what his uncle had started, but only if he was willing to risk everything on the chance that justice could still prevail over corruption and money. He reached into his jacket and pulled out copies of the documents he'd found in the hidden compartment, including the original territorial deed and Uncle Jeremiah's detailed records of Blackstone family activities. "Deputy Torres, I think it's time to officially reopen my uncle's case." Torres smiled as she began examining the documents Ray had provided. "Mr. Dobbs, I think you're right, and I think your uncle would be proud of what you're doing." As Ray left the sheriff's department that evening, Duke waiting patiently in the truck, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for his inheritance anymore. He was fighting for justice for Uncle Jeremiah, and for all the other victims of the Blackstone family's criminal enterprise. The game had changed. Now it was time to change the rules. Ray spent the next morning making phone calls to the names in Uncle Jeremiah's address book, explaining the situation to environmental lawyers in Denver, investigative journalists in San Francisco, and mining rights experts in Washington, D.C. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial skepticism, growing interest as Ray described the evidence he'd gathered, and finally a request for copies of the documents that proved the Blackstone family's criminal activities. By noon, He had commitments from 3 different organizations to investigate the case, including a team of environmental lawyers who specialized in taking on corporate corruption, and a journalist from the Washington Post who had been following similar patterns of intimidation and illegal land acquisition across the western states. But as Ray was learning, exposing the truth and surviving long enough to testify about it were 2 different challenges. Deputy Torres called just after lunch with news that sent a chill down his spine. Marcus Blackstone just posted a $1 million bond for 2 men who were arrested in Helena yesterday, Torres said, without preamble. Officially, they're contractors hired to do environmental assessments. Unofficially, they're muscle from out of state with criminal records that include arson, assault, and what the FBI calls corporate enforcement activities. Ray looked out, the window toward the hills surrounding his property, suddenly aware of how isolated the Lucky Strike Saloon really was. How long before they get here? They're probably already here, Torres said. Blackstone also filed paperwork yesterday claiming that your property represents an environmental hazard that requires immediate remediation. He's got a court order authorizing him to conduct emergency surveys and soil testing, which gives his people legal cover to be on your land. Can you stop them? Torres's pause told Ray everything he needed to know. I can't legally prevent them from executing a valid court order, even if I know it's bogus. What I can do is make sure there are witnesses around when they show up. I'll be conducting my own patrol of the area, and I've asked the State Environmental Office to send their own team to verify Blackstone's claims. After Torres hung up, Ray stood in the empty saloon, Duke beside him, both of them understanding that the final confrontation was approaching faster than he'd expected. The phone calls he'd made that morning had bought him allies and potential protection, but they wouldn't help him survive the next 24 hours if Blackstone decided to use the same solution he'd used on Uncle Jeremiah. Duke seemed to sense Ray's thoughts. The dog moved purposefully toward the back of the saloon, pausing at the base of the stairs and looking back as if to say, "Follow me." Ray had learned to trust the German shepherd's instincts, so he followed Duke upstairs and watched as the dog went directly to Uncle Jeremiah's bedroom. The dog positioned himself in front of the old wardrobe and began scratching at its base, just as he had with the floorboards downstairs. Ray knelt beside Duke and examined the wardrobe more carefully, running his hands along the carved wooden base until he found what the dog had discovered, a section that moved when pressed. The hidden panel slid aside to reveal a space that Uncle Jeremiah had used to store more than just documents. Ray found himself looking at a small armory that suggested his uncle had been preparing for exactly the kind of confrontation that was now inevitable. 2 rifles lay wrapped in oiled cloth, a hunting rifle with a scope and a military-style carbine that looked like it belonged in a war zone rather than a Montana saloon. Boxes of ammunition were stacked neatly beside cleaning supplies and what looked like several $1,000s in cash. But what caught Ray's attention was a leather holster containing a .45 automatic pistol and a note in Uncle Jeremiah's handwriting. "Ray, if you're reading this, it means Duke has shown you what you need to protect yourself. I never wanted it to come to this, but the Blackstone family doesn't understand any language except violence. The carbine is fully automatic and completely illegal, so use it only if your life depends on it. The hunting rifle is clean and registered in my name, which should transfer to you with the property. The pistol belonged to our father. He carried it in Korea, and he would want you to have it. Trust Deputy Torres if she's still around, but don't trust anyone else in law enforcement until this is over. They've bought too many people over the years. Be smart, be careful, and remember that you're fighting for more than just yourself. You're fighting for everyone the Blackstones have hurt, and everyone they'll hurt if they're not stopped. Make them pay for what they did to our family." Ray hefted the .45, surprised by how familiar it felt in his hands. His father had taught him to shoot with a similar pistol, back when Ray was young enough to believe that his family's arguments were just ordinary disagreements. Now he understood that his father had been trying to prepare him for a war that had started long before. Ray was born. Duke watched approvingly as Ray loaded the pistol and secured it in the shoulder holster he found with Uncle Jeremiah's gear. The dog's behavior had changed over the past few days, becoming more alert and protective, as if he understood that the situation was approaching a climax that would require both cunning and courage. Ray spent the afternoon preparing the Lucky Strike Saloon for what might be its final battle. Using techniques he'd learned during his brief stint in the army 30 years earlier, he created defensive positions that would give him advantages if Blackstone's people decided to attack directly. The saloon's old construction actually worked in his favor. Thick wooden walls that would stop small-caliber bullets, multiple exits that couldn't all be covered simultaneously, and a second-floor position that provided excellent fields of fire. More importantly, Ray used Uncle Jeremiah's maps to position supplies and weapons throughout the building, ensuring that he could move from room to room without being trapped in any single location. The carbine went upstairs in the bedroom, where Ray could cover the approaches to the building. The hunting rifle was positioned behind the bar, where it could command the main floor. Emergency supplies, water, medical kit, extra ammunition were hidden in multiple locations so that losing one cache wouldn't leave him helpless. As evening approached, Martha arrived with news that made Ray's preparations seem even more urgent. They're setting up some kind of base camp about 2 miles from here, she reported, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into a chair where she could watch the windows. 3 trailers, enough vehicles for a small army, and equipment that looks more like military gear than environmental testing. How many people? Hard to say exactly, but I counted at least 12 men, all wearing the same kind of tactical clothing. None of them looked like scientists or environmental inspectors. Martha paused, studying Ray's face. This is really happening, isn't it? They're going to try to kill you just like they killed Jeremiah. Ray nodded, checking the loads in the hunting rifle for the 3rd time. Probably tonight, while they can claim it was some kind of accident during their environmental assessment. By morning I'll be missing, and they'll have found evidence that I was engaged in illegal mining activities that contaminated the groundwater. Have you thought about just leaving? You could disappear, let them have the land, and surface somewhere, else with enough evidence to expose them later. It was a reasonable suggestion, and Ray had considered it seriously. But every time he thought about running, he remembered Uncle Jeremiah's journal entries and the photograph of his uncle standing proudly in front of the saloon. This wasn't just about gold or land ownership. It was about standing up to bullies who thought they could terrorize people into submission. "I'm not running," Ray said finally. "My uncle tried to fight them alone, and they killed him for it. But I'm not alone. I've got allies now, people who are watching what happens here. If the Blackstones want a war, they're going to get one, but this time the whole world is going to be watching." As if summoned by their conversation, Duke appeared at the window, growling low in his throat. Ray joined the dog and peered out into the gathering dusk, seeing nothing at first. Then movement caught his eye. Dark figures moving through the trees on the hillside above the saloon, positioning themselves for what looked like a coordinated assault. "Martha, you need to leave," Ray said urgently. "Call Deputy Torres and tell her it's starting, then get as far away from here as you can." Martha stood but didn't move toward the door. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone." "Yes, you are," Ray said firmly. "This isn't your fight, and I won't have your death on my conscience. Go to the sheriff's office and make sure Torres knows exactly what's happening here. If I don't make it through tonight, at least make sure she has enough evidence to destroy the Blackstone family." Martha finally agreed to leave, but not before making Ray promise to call if he survived the night. As her truck disappeared down the dirt road, Ray felt the weight of solitude settling around him like armor. He was alone now, except for Duke, facing enemies who'd been planning this confrontation for years. But he wasn't the same broken-down cowboy who had arrived at the Lucky Strike Saloon a week earlier. He had purpose now, and allies, and most Importantly, he had the truth about what the Blackstone family had done to his uncle and countless other victims. Whatever happened tonight, that truth would survive. Ray checked his weapons one final time, ensured that all the documentary evidence was hidden where it could be found by investigators, and settled into his defensive position behind the bar. Duke took up his station by the front door, ears alert and muscles coiled for action. Outside, darkness was falling across the Montana hills, and somewhere in that darkness, Marcus Blackstone's hired killers were preparing to finish what his father had started 30 years earlier. But this time, they weren't facing an isolated old man with no allies and no hope of justice. This time, they were facing Ray Dobbs, and he was ready for them. They came at midnight, when the darkness was deepest and the wind was strong enough to muffle the sound of approaching vehicles. Ray heard them before he saw them, the soft crunch of gravel under tires, the careful closing of car doors, the whispered coordination of men who had done this kind of work before. Duke's growl was so low it was more vibration than sound, but Ray felt it through the floorboards where the dog lay pressed against the bar. Together, they watched through the gap in the boarded windows as dark figures moved into position around the saloon. Professional soldiers, Ray realized, not the local thugs he'd been expecting. Marcus Blackstone had brought serious firepower to this confrontation. The first sign of attack came not from gunfire, but from something much more subtle, the acrid smell of gasoline beginning to seep through the walls. They were trying to burn him out, probably hoping to make his death look like an accident caused by the old building's faulty electrical system. Ray moved quickly to the back of the saloon, where Uncle Jeremiah's maps had shown him exactly what he was looking for. In the floor behind the old piano, hidden under a loose board, was the original entrance to the McAllister mine. Uncle Jeremiah had kept it accessible, probably as an emergency escape route for exactly this kind of situation. The wooden cover came away easily, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness. Ray grabbed his emergency pack and the hunting rifle, whistling softly for Duke to follow, but instead of heading down into the mine, Ray had a different plan. As flames began to lick at the saloon's exterior walls, Ray used the mine entrance as cover while he worked his way to a position that Uncle Jeremiah's defensive preparations had made possible. A hidden tunnel connected the mine to the old stable, emerging behind the building where Blackstone's men wouldn't expect resistance. Ray reached the stable just as the saloon's front windows exploded from the heat, sending sparks and burning debris across the yard. In the dancing light of the flames, he could see 6 men positioned around the building, all of them watching for him to emerge from the burning structure. What they weren't watching for was the shot that came from the stable's hayloft, where Ray had positioned himself with a clear field of fire. The hunting rifle spoke once, and the man closest to the saloon dropped without a sound. The others scattered, suddenly aware that their target wasn't trapped in the burning building after all. Duke had followed Ray through the tunnel, and now positioned himself at the stable's rear entrance, guarding against anyone who might try to flank them. The dog's military training was evident in the way he moved, silent, alert, and utterly focused on protecting his human partner. Ray Dobbs! Marcus Blackstone's voice carried across the yard, amplified by some kind of electronic device. This doesn't have to end badly for you. Come out and we can discuss terms. Ray didn't bother responding. He'd heard the same kind of lies that Blackstone's father had probably told Uncle Jeremiah right before they killed him. Instead, he used the scope on the hunting rifle to locate Blackstone's position, behind one of the black SUVs, surrounded by at least 4 armed men. The second shot took out the SUV's front tire, sending the vehicle listing to one side and destroying Blackstone's cover. The return fire was immediate and professional, bullets chewing through the stable's wooden walls with precision that spoke of military training and expensive weapons. Ray moved to a different position, using the layout of the stable and Uncle Jeremiah's prepared defensive positions to stay ahead of the incoming fire. This was where the old building's construction worked in his favor. thick beams and stone foundations that could stop rifle bullets, multiple levels that allowed him to change position without exposing himself, and escape routes that led back to the mine tunnel if retreat became necessary. It was while changing position that Ray discovered what Uncle Jeremiah had hidden in the stable's foundation, actual samples of gold ore from the McAllister Lode, carefully preserved and documented as proof of the deposit's value. The ore samples were beautiful, shot through with veins of gold that gleamed even in the dim light of Ray's flashlight. More importantly, the samples came with documentation that proved the geological surveys Uncle Jeremiah had been studying. According to the assay reports hidden with the ore, the McAllister Lode was even richer than the original 1880s estimates had suggested. Modern mining techniques could extract gold worth potentially $200 million, making it one of the most valuable undeveloped deposits in the western United States. Ray pocketed one of the smaller ore samples, evidence that would prove to investigators exactly what the Blackstone family had been killing for, and moved back to his rifle position. Outside, the saloon was now fully engulfed in flames, the old building surrendering to fire with the dignity of something that had served its purpose well. Blackstone's men were closing in on the stable now, using the confusion and distraction of the fire to advance under cover. Ray could hear them communicating with hand signals and whispered radio calls, coordinating their assault with the kind of precision that suggested extensive training. Duke alerted him to movement at the stables. Rear entrance, 2 men trying to flank his position, while the others kept him pinned down with covering fire. Ray switched to the .45 automatic, knowing that close-quarters combat would require a different kind of weapon than long-range shooting. The first man through the door walked into Duke's attack, 90 pounds of trained German shepherd, moving with the speed and precision of a guided missile. The man's scream was cut short by powerful jaws closing on his throat, and his companion hesitated just long enough for Ray's pistol to find its target. But the assault was far from over. Ray could hear more vehicles arriving, probably reinforcements that Blackstone had kept in reserve. The stable that had seemed like a fortress was beginning to feel like a trap, and Ray knew that time was running out. That's when he heard the sound that changed everything. Sirens in the distance, growing, closer by the second. Deputy Torres had apparently decided that a court order wasn't worth letting civilians die, and she was bringing help, whether her superiors approved or not. Ray keyed the radio he'd taken from one of the fallen attackers. "Blackstone, you hear? Those sirens? Your private war just became very public. I'd suggest you cut your losses and run." The response was a hail of gunfire that shattered what remained of the stable's windows and sent splinters flying through the air like wooden shrapnel. But Ray could hear uncertainty in the shooting now, desperation rather than confidence. Blackstone's men were realizing that their carefully planned assassination had turned into a public firefight, with law enforcement approaching fast. As the sirens grew louder, Ray prepared for what he knew would be Blackstone's final, desperate assault. The developer had invested too much in this conspiracy to retreat now, and he had too many crimes to hide to allow witnesses to survive. The real battle was just beginning. The sirens were close enough now that Ray could see the flashing lights reflecting off the clouds of smoke from the burning saloon. But Marcus Blackstone apparently had one more card to play, a final gambit that would either eliminate the evidence of his family's crimes or destroy him in the attempt. Ray heard the distinctive sound of a helicopter approaching, its rotor wash adding to the chaos of wind and fire that surrounded the battlefield. Through the stable's broken windows, he could see Blackstone's remaining men falling back toward a cleared area where the aircraft could land, a tactical withdrawal designed to extract the team before law enforcement arrived. But Blackstone himself wasn't retreating. Instead, he was advancing toward the stable, apparently determined to finish what his father had started, regardless of the personal cost. Ray could see him moving from cover to cover, using the burning saloon as a backdrop that would silhouette any target he might find. "You can't hide forever, Dobbs," Blackstone shouted over the noise of flames and approaching sirens. "Even if you survive tonight, you'll never be safe. My family has resources you can't imagine." Ray moved carefully to a position where he could see Blackstone's approach, while remaining hidden himself. Duke stayed close, the dog's training evident in the way he anticipated Ray's movements and provided silent protection against flanking attacks. It was while repositioning that Ray discovered Uncle Jeremiah's final surprise, a complete map of the McAllister Lode system, far more detailed than anything he'd seen before. This map showed not just the main tunnels and mining chambers, but a comprehensive network of natural caves and artificial passages that connected multiple points across his property. More importantly, the map included modern notations that revealed the true scope of what Uncle Jeremiah had discovered. The McAllister Lode wasn't just a single gold vein. It was part of a larger geological formation that included silver, copper, and rare earth minerals worth potentially $500 million. No wonder the Blackstone family had been willing to commit murder to control it. Ray folded the map carefully and tucked it inside his jacket, along with the gold ore sample that would prove the deposit's value. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he was determined that this evidence would survive to expose the truth about the conspiracy. The sound of splintering wood announced Blackstone's entry into the stable through what had once been the main door. Ray could hear him moving carefully through the debris, probably using night vision equipment to locate his target in the smoke-filled darkness. "I know you're in here, Dobbs," Blackstone called out, his voice closer now. "And I know you've found my family's property. That gold has belonged to us for 3 generations, ever since my great-grandfather arranged to have the original mining operation shut down." Ray remained silent, using the sound of Blackstone's voice to track his position while staying hidden behind a pile of old hay bales and farming equipment. Duke was coiled beside him, waiting for the signal to attack. "You want to know what really happened to your uncle?" Blackstone continued, apparently trying to draw Ray into revealing his position. "He was stubborn, just like you. Thought he could fight us with lawyers and publicity. My father tried to reason with him, but Jeremiah wouldn't listen." The arrogance in Blackstone's voice was absolute, the certainty of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Ray could hear him moving closer, boots crunching on debris and broken glass. "So we did what we had to do," Blackstone said, "just like we're doing now. The difference is, when they find your body tomorrow, it's going to look like you died trying to illegally mine on federal land. Very tragic accident during an environmental assessment." That was when Ray made his move, using a technique Uncle Jeremiah had apparently taught Duke years earlier. Ray whistled a signal that sent the German Shepherd around Blackstone's flank, while Ray provided a distraction from the front. The plan worked perfectly. Duke's attack came from Blackstone's blind spot, the dog's massive frame hitting the developer like a furry guided missile. Blackstone's shot went wild, the muzzle flash revealing his position for Ray's return fire. But Blackstone was tougher than Ray had expected. He managed to fight off Duke's attack and roll behind cover, blood streaming from bite wounds on his arm, but still armed and dangerous. "You killed my uncle," Ray said, advancing carefully with his pistol ready. "Murdered him for gold that was never yours to begin with. Ancient history," Blackstone snarled, clutching his wounded arm. "What matters is the future, and you don't have one." The final confrontation came down to 2 men with guns, facing each other across the wreckage of a stable that had sheltered 3 generations of secrets. Outside, the sirens were deafeningly close, and the helicopter was settling into its landing area. But inside the stable, time seemed suspended as Ray and Marcus Blackstone measured each other for what both men knew would be the last time. "Your family's finished," Ray said quietly. "I've got enough evidence to destroy all of you, and people who will make sure that evidence sees daylight." Blackstone's laugh was bitter and desperate. "Evidence won't bring your uncle back, and it won't save you. He raised his weapon for a final shot, but Duke was already moving, having circled around for a second attack. The dog's intervention threw off Blackstone's aim just enough for Ray's shot to find its target. Marcus Blackstone fell, among the debris of his family's conspiracy, his weapon clattering across the stable floor. As sirens wailed outside and Duke stood guard over the fallen enemy, Ray realized that the war that had started with his great-grandfather's generation was finally over. The truth about the McAllister Lode, about Uncle Jeremiah's murder, and about 3 generations of Blackstone family crimes would finally see the light of day. 6 months later, Ray stood on the front porch of the rebuilt Lucky Strike Saloon, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the valley where Cedar Flats was slowly coming back to life. The building behind him was no longer the crumbling relic he'd inherited. It was a working saloon again, complete with gleaming bar, functioning piano, and the kind of warm atmosphere that drew people from 3 counties away. Duke lay beside him in the morning sunshine, the old German shepherd showing his age, but still alert to every sound and movement in his territory. The dog had become something of a local celebrity after the newspapers picked up the story of his role in exposing the Blackstone conspiracy. Photographers from as far away as Denver had come to take pictures of the hero dog who had helped solve a decades-old murder case. The legal aftermath of that night had been swift and comprehensive. Marcus Blackstone's surviving men had cooperated fully with investigators, providing evidence that led to the arrest of corrupt officials throughout the state. The Blackstone Development Company had been dissolved, its assets seized to compensate victims of the family's criminal enterprise. Most importantly, Detective Morrison's suppressed files had been vindicated, and Uncle Jeremiah's case had been officially reclassified as a homicide with justice finally served. But for Ray, the real satisfaction came from what he'd built on the foundation of that justice. The mining partnership agreement on his desk represented more than just a business arrangement. It was a testament to Uncle Jeremiah's belief that some things were worth more than money. Rather than selling the mineral rights to the highest bidder, Ray had formed the Cedar Flats Community Mining Cooperative, a partnership that included Martha, Agnes, Coleman from the general store, and several other local families whose lives had been disrupted by Blackstone intimidation tactics. The cooperative would develop the McAllister Lode using environmentally responsible methods, with profits shared among all members and a significant portion dedicated to restoring the town and surrounding area. Modern geological surveys had confirmed what Uncle Jeremiah's research had suggested. The McAllister Lode was indeed one of the richest undeveloped gold deposits in the western United States. But rather than rushing to extract every ounce as quickly as possible, the cooperative had committed to sustainable mining practices that would provide steady income for generations, while preserving the natural beauty that made Cedar Flats special. The first mining operations had begun 3 months earlier, using equipment and techniques that Uncle Jeremiah would have approved of. Small-scale, carefully planned extractions that followed the natural contours of the lode while minimizing environmental impact. The gold they'd recovered so far was enough to fund the saloon's restoration, improve infrastructure throughout Cedar Flats, and establish a trust fund that would ensure the town's long-term economic stability. Ray's transformation was evident. In more than just his financial circumstances, the broken-down cowboy, who had arrived at the Lucky Strike Saloon 6 months earlier, had been replaced by a man with purpose and community connections that extended far beyond the boundaries of his property. He served on the County Planning Commission, had been elected president of the local historical society, and was in discussions with the state tourism office about establishing Cedar Flats as a heritage site. More personally satisfying was the reconciliation with family that Uncle Jeremiah's legacy had made possible. Ray's cousin Sarah, Uncle Jeremiah's daughter whom Ray hadn't spoken to in over 20 years, had driven up from Colorado to attend the Saloon's reopening celebration. Their conversation had been awkward at first, weighed down by decades of misunderstanding and neglect, but it had ended with plans for regular visits and a shared commitment to honoring their father's memory. "I wish Dad could see what you've done here," Sarah had said, standing in the restored saloon and looking at the photographs that now lined the walls, images of Uncle Jeremiah, Ray's father, and 3 generations of family history that had nearly been lost to pride and silence. "I think he can," Ray had replied, and meant it. Uncle Jeremiah's presence was everywhere in the building, in the careful restoration that had preserved original details while adding modern safety features, in the mining partnership agreement that reflected his values of community and environmental responsibility, and in the simple fact that the Lucky Strike Saloon was once again a place where people gathered to share stories and build connections. Martha had become more than just a neighbor. She was Ray's partner in both the mining cooperative and the gradual rebuilding of their personal lives. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared experiences and mutual respect rather than passion or desperation. At their age, Ray reflected, that kind of foundation was probably more valuable than the intense but fragile connections of youth. Deputy Torres had been promoted to chief investigator, her handling of the Blackstone case having earned recognition throughout the state law enforcement community. She still stopped by the saloon regularly, partly for professional reasons. The Lucky Strike had become an unofficial headquarters for investigating other cases of corporate intimidation in rural communities, and partly because she'd become a friend whose opinion Ray valued on everything from mining operations to community development. Agnes had donated her grandfather's mining journals and photographs to the Cedar Flats Historical Society, which now occupied a restored section of the saloon building. Visitors could trace the complete history of the McAllister Lode from its discovery in 1881 through the conspiracy that had hidden it for over a century, and finally to its current development as a model of sustainable mining practices. Even Coleman, from the general store, had found new prosperity as Cedar Flats began attracting visitors interested in its unique history and ongoing mining operations. His store now carried specialized equipment for tourists who wanted to try their hand at gold panning, as well as books and maps that told the complete story of the area's mining heritage. As Ray watched the morning activities in the valley below, mining, trucks heading out to the day's work sites, tourists arriving for guided tours of the operation, school children gathering for educational programs about geology and local history, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from building something and that would outlast his own lifetime. Duke stirred beside him, lifting his head to watch a familiar pickup truck approaching the saloon. Martha was arriving for their weekly planning meeting, her own transformation as evident as Ray's. She'd sold her struggling ranch to the mining cooperative and now managed the ecological restoration aspects of their operation, ensuring that disturbed areas were properly rehabilitated and that wildlife habitat was preserved throughout the development process. "Morning, Ray," she called as she climbed out of her truck, Duke rising to greet her with the gentle enthusiasm of an old dog who had learned to trust again. "Ready to change the world?" Ray smiled, watching as Martha scratched behind Duke's ears and surveyed the bustling activity that had transformed Cedar Flats from a dying ghost town into a thriving community. "I think we already have," he said. The mining partnership agreement on his desk represented more than just business arrangements and profit sharing. It represented the values that Uncle Jeremiah had died defending. Community over individual, profit, environmental responsibility over short-term extraction, and the belief that some legacies were worth preserving regardless of their monetary value. As Ray and Martha headed inside to plan the next phase of their operations, Duke settled back into his preferred spot on the porch, guardian of a place that had become home to all of them. The Lucky Strike Saloon was no longer just a building. It was the heart of a community that had learned the difference between surviving and thriving. Sometimes life really did give you exactly what you needed, even when you were too stubborn to recognize the gift. For Ray Dobbs, that gift had come in the form of a crumbling saloon, an old dog, and the chance to finish what someone else had started. It was, he reflected, more than most men got, and exactly what he'd needed to discover who he was meant to be